Council alone was addressing us on the issue that was ahead of us, and Father Bill kindly hosted us then for a pre-referendum event. I don't think any of us could have expected the referendum to have gone exactly as it has gone, and I think it's probably no exaggeration to say that many people find themselves shell-shocked after the referendum. We felt it was really important to try to bring people together to look at, I suppose perhaps to look a little bit around the campaign, to look a little bit around the pro-life movement in Ireland, and a little bit around how we dust ourselves down again and keep involved in that vital work of promoting the gospel of life and ensuring that all human life is respected and human dignity that is so important to us, and that continues to be something important rather than feeling just defeated or that we lost and we should crawl under a rock. It's something I spoke very much with Father Baylor, the director of the Notre Dame Newman Centre for Faith and Culture here. I was delighted that he was very generously willing to host this event tonight. So there's not much reason for me to speak for much longer. You haven't come here to hear from me, so I'm going to introduce now Father Bill Daly, who is going to be the moderator for tonight's discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks for the idea of this panel. Thank all of you for being here. It's my pleasure to welcome you, as Michael did, to Newman University Church, this place where we at the University of Notre Dame, my colleague Steve Warner and I, are privileged to serve at the Notre Dame Newman Center for Faith and Reason. It was also my great privilege and pleasure, hard as the work was at times, and unsettling as the result was, during the referendum campaign, to at various points work with each of our three distinguished panelists tonight. So I look forward to hearing from them. You didn't come here to hear from me any more than from Michael, but I'm going to say just one or two things before we begin. Since we're in a church and I'm a priest and I can't resist. And both in terms of the referendum and other matters that need to be specified, of which we're all keenly aware, the times can feel dark. And thinking about the future of the pro-life movement as we're discussing tonight can seem as though there's an urgency to it because history is coming towards an end. But you know, in St. Paul's time, in the first century of Christianity, everyone thought Jesus is coming back imminently, and you know, we're already messing things up. And for the last 2,000 years since, people have thought, well, the first 1,000 years, that was the beginning, but surely the second 1,000, that's toward the end. It's only for God to know whether the first 2,000 years of Christianity are its infancy or its elderly stages. We tend to be fixated on our own times as the most important, but it's good for us to remember that the gospel of life always has a future. Love always has a future. And for us to reflect upon our role in that future and how we can help to build that future is an exercise in people who are reminded time and again by the Lord that his kingdom grows as the mustard seed, from something very small into something very large. And that the grass grows when the farmer goes to sleep at night and he knows not how. So as we think about and in some ways try to predict the future, we do so with humility and always as a Christian people with hope. For even when things look disturbing, we remember that it is our Lord who has the words of life and is the bread of life and is the way and the truth of the life. And with that and no further ado, David Quinn, you all will recognize, especially from his column in the Irish Catholic. But beyond his column in the Irish Catholic, you might also read the Sunday Times, Ireland edition, in which he is also a columnist, and you're probably well familiar with his distinguished work as the founding director of the Iona Institute, which does so much to promote so many important issues, especially issues at the heart of this week in the well-being of families. And so, David has, well, I suppose it's between David and Maria for the least happy task, but David's unhappy task is to give us a little bit of a retrospective on the referendum itself. David.
Hello everyone, thanks Father Bill. Thanks for all coming tonight. So I think the way we're dividing this up, we'll each speak for maybe 15 minutes, and I'm going to back to the referendum, and Maria is going to look at the present situation and the legislation on offer, and Maria is going to look forward to the future of the pro-life movement, and plenty of time for question and discussion, I think, is the way we have this done. So, can you all hear me? Yeah. Okay. The scale of the victory took us all by surprise for the other side. It was really shocking, and in fact, it even surprised the other side. They didn't think they would win by that much. If you look back on all kinds of various campaigns in recent times, Brexit, Trump, all kinds of surprising things happening in various votes. And I wonder now if people actually know their own mind when they're about to go into the ballot box, so to speak, into the voting booths. I think some people are surprised at how they voted themselves, frankly, because I met people who were kind of surprised they voted yes. And I met people who said, I was going to vote no, and then suddenly at the last minute something made me vote yes. And you just wonder what kind of group psychology was going on. But apart from the scale of the defeat, what surprised me as well was the vote was lower than against same-sex marriage, because that was 38% and this was a little over 33%. And I would have thought this was a much easier thing to argue. I know they're not directly comparable, and some people might have voted yes last time and no this time, and a few maybe vice versa. But it was surprising, because when people asked in 2015 about same-sex marriage, what's the harm, that was a harder question to answer. But this time, what's the harm when it kills an unborn baby? It's very easy to answer the question, what's the harm? So how did we do worse? And that will take a lot of unpacking going forward, so I have no magic answer, right now. And this is particularly about the fact that the pro-age campaign, the pro-life campaign overall was so much bigger than the campaign in favour of traditional marriage in 2015. So much more money, so many more volunteers, more politicians on our side, and yet we did worse. So that was the most stunning part of it for me. So we're 1-3. And it was a complete reversal of what happened in 1983, so 35 years ago. So the 8th Amendment was carried by 2-1 and now it's defeated by 2-1. And so it's just completely flipped on its head. So I'm just going to make a kind of stab at what happened, and many of you will know these things anyway, but let's go through some of them. So if you go back to 1983, and I had a look at what some of the papers were saying at the time, there was no paper in favour of the 8th Amendment. So even 35 years ago, with 2/3 of voters in favour of the 8th Amendment, there was no major media in favour of the 8th Amendment, so going all the way back. So this time we lose by 2-1, and there's people suggesting, okay, you're now a minority, you're only 1/3, you're a rump, time to drive you off the stage, and none of you should ever have a platform again. But that wasn't the line in 1983. So, if you like, they lost, so to speak, by 2-1. Nobody was saying apply to the platforms. On the contrary, they were given more platforms than ever in order to reverse the vote. So, what happened in a way, there was a 35-year-long campaign right from the get-go about the 8th Amendment and how awful it was and how we needed to reverse it. So, right from the get-go, there was a campaign against it. Whereas, again, this time we've been told this is the will of the people, it's locked in stone forever. So while the church must change its doctrines, pro-choice doctrine is unquestionable and must be accepted forevermore. And that's it. It is the end of the story and the end of the line for us, which of course is not one little bit. We've just got to take the long view, but Breda will deal with that. So in order to unravel the 8th Amendment, a huge concentration on the hard cases down the years, and particularly in recent years, and these are undoubted hard cases. So obviously rape is a horrible, horrible case, and an extremely hard case for us to deal with, and the 8th Amendment for bad abortion in cases of rape. We have the so-called fatal fetal abnormality, which is a life-limiting condition, as we prefer to say, or just terminal illness. And we had all the personal stories around the so-called fatal fetal abnormality. So, people saying I shouldn't have to go to England for this, that was just inhumane and cruel, and we had the UN committees saying the same thing, this would get widespread publicity. And then we had women and couples saying, well, I didn't make that choice, I decided to carry my baby to term, even though the baby was only going to live for a very short amount of time. And actually, at the end of the day, those personal stories, which were pro-life personal stories, was still actually working against us in a weird way, because people at home were thinking, well, her choice was to go to England and your choice was to stay home. That's great, and those two choices are equally valid, and it's all about choice. So I think that's how a lot of people were translating this in their own brains. Both sets of personal stories were actually reinforcing the pro-choice narrative. I mean, the horrible case that Sabina Hanabar that happened in 2012, and the law, the Protection of Human Life During Pregnancy Act, so-called, was passed in summer 2013, and it was a game changer, because I think an awful lot of people made up their mind at that point that the 8th Amendment had to go, and they're thinking, this killed someone. And she died because we're a Catholic country, and she couldn't be given the treatment she needed because of the 8th Amendment. So the 8th Amendment is a killer, literally. And so they decided that was it. A lot of people made up their mind, I think, at that point. And, you know, you were blue in the face trying to say, well, actually, the 8th Amendment was not the problem here. You know, women in England tragically die of sepsis poisoning as well, and in the States, I guess sometimes it's simply not spotted, or whatever the case may be. But I don't want to rehash all that. Just suffice it to say that a lot of people made up their mind at that point. And of course, we saw how some PDs and senators, you know, Lucinda Creighton, Terence Flanagan, etc., bravely voted no to that law and were all expelled from the party. And just as an aside, I mean, that's the political version of excommunication, when you think about it, because you're expelled from your parliamentary party. You know, you're thrown outside of the political community of your own party, so to speak, and immediately we're all supporting that. You know, the church itself is allowed to have no discipline around anything, including, you know, the right to life itself. So we saw people saying it's okay to be Catholic and vote yes, because I just think it's appalling. So another problem is, all down the years, people are acquainted with the hard cases that argue against the 8th Amendment, but they were simply in no way, shape or form made properly acquainted with the hard cases for the pro-choice or pro-abortion side, the kind of cases that would routinely occur in places like Britain and America. So just to go through some of them briefly: late-term abortions, so we're talking third trimester, and the so-called partial birth abortions. I shouldn't say so-called, because that's what they are. And people just completely unfamiliar with these things. Babies born alive after abortion are left to die, which happens reasonably commonly, and people never told about this. Scandals involving abortion clinics, and these scandals could be just simply that they don't have proper health standards, that they don't get proper consent from the woman to the abortion, that doctors, because in England, as you probably know, 2 doctors are supposed to pre-sign the form before she has the abortion, and some of these forms pre-signed, and it causes, you know, no reaction here because not reported. We have the horrible examples of miscarried and aborted babies having their bodies thrown into the hospital incinerators, all right, by the thousands, and this gets no publicity whatsoever. Meanwhile, we hear all about Cuban babies, which goes back to 1961, who died naturally, but we're not hearing about these babies killed in here and now deliberately, and their bodies thrown into hospital incinerators, so nobody knows about that. In the States, International Planned Parenthood, trading essentially in fetal body parts, nobody heard about that. Eugenics, so they heard a little bit about that very late in the day, which is the mass aborting of children with disabilities, particularly Down syndrome, so 90% diagnosed with Down syndrome, countries like Britain, get aborted, say in America. In Britain, in Denmark, the figure is more like 98%. In Iceland, some years it's been 100%. And the only time people get to hear about that here is when we raise it, and then we're told it's impolite to raise it. It's impolite to raise it. So in a few years' time, we wake up and there'll be hardly any of these children left because it was impolite to raise it. So we were immediately, you know, slapped down for raising eugenics and told we were impolite for calling it eugenics, which it manifestly is, because what eugenics means is well born, and so these are not considered fit to be born, and someday they won't be born, and because it was impolite to raise them. So it's just horrible. And then gender selective abortions, so in some communities more girls than boys get aborted. And then the sheer scale of abortion in all these countries. You know, 1 baby aborted for every 4 born in Britain, 1 baby aborted for every 3 born in Sweden, which is held as a model country. We're not told about that either. So we were told nothing but nothing about the realities of abortion in these other countries. So we only hear about the horrible realities of the 8th Amendment in this country. So people were just woefully misinformed. during the campaign. So we were all subjected to really hard questioning. But how often did you hear Simon Harris being subjected to hard questioning? It just didn't happen. I mean, there was a press conference that Iona held during the campaign, and Maria was at it too, and the hostility of the journalists had to be seen to be believed. And there happened to be a press conference that day in the same hotel, Boswell's, by one of the pro-choice groups. And one of the journalists, who was fair-minded, he said, "Oh my God, the difference is huge between the press conference here, Iona, and the press conference next door for this pro-choice group. All soft questioning. In with us, basically the terror or WhatsApp." And we have it online on our Facebook page, and again, it has to be seen to be believed. We have the church scandals, which did the most fantastic damage, obviously. And I mean, when you think about it, it's just so horrible, because those scandals, child sexual abuse, I mean, it's just very hard to contemplate, and it just made it easier to pass an abortion law. And when you think about what that involves, okay, the death of an unborn child, so the sheer irony of that, but that does the colossal damage and completely undermined the moral witness of the church, but also undermined the moral witness of lay Catholics who had absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with any of that, but it does undermine the entire enterprise. And even though the pro-life argument can be made completely independently of religion, you still carried all this baggage into the campaign. I think as well, we have to face the fact that we are just I'll finish up now in a couple of minutes, we're a massively changed culture in which the highest value is considered to be autonomy and therefore choice. And so again, some of these people who after the campaign are coming up to me, "Oh David, I don't know why I voted yes, really, I wasn't going to vote yes, but then I voted yes." And you're kind of thinking, I think I know the reason why. It's because it is a backup when contraception fails. You're not supposed to say that, but it's obviously absolutely true, because you don't want a baby, and that's why you're using contraception. And you end up, and a baby is on the way, and you don't want this, and that's why in these cultures you end up with such a high abortion rate. And so it's simply considered part of the way we live now. And some people might regard it as an evil, but might see it as a necessary evil. And there were people, by the way, in the campaign who admitted it's a baby. I know it's a baby, and I know it kills a baby, but I'm sorry, a woman's right to choose comes first, and an awful lot of people believe that. So I would say of the 2/3 who voted to repeal the 8th Amendment, probably about half of them are hardcore, and half of them are thinking evil necessity. So I'm going to vote for it, and we have it anyway. Just very briefly, could we all have run the campaign better, all the various pro-life groups? I'm sure we could have, but actually looking back, I just don't see how this is winnable. I'd say on a really good day, we might have got to about 40%. But I just find it very hard to work out in my head what was the pathway to victory in this, given all the things I've just described. So, I mean, I'm going to finish on that note, but it won't be, I mean, that is a pessimistic note, obviously, but Bree will hopefully have a more optimistic version in the last part of this evening's proceedings. So, thank you.
As always, David Quinn brings the sunshine and butterflies. David is an astute a movie-goer and movie reviewer, and I'm always trying to get him to review movies in his column to give people a broader sense of who he is. He says, "That's not my brand." So I can't get him to go off brand there, and he stayed on brand tonight. Thank you, David, for very insightful remarks, even those that were just pleasant to deliver. I should have mentioned as well, especially in this week of World Meeting of Families, that in addition to the more pedestrian columns that I mentioned, David is a wonderful husband and a father. Maria Steen, a wonderful wife and mother. You would also recognize from her column in the Irish Catholic. You may also know that she is a barrister and frequent spokeswoman for the Iona Institute. Marie is going to speak to us from her background as a barrister about the legal and political situation going forward.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid that negativity doesn't really improve with the test that I started with. I think I've probably drawn the short straw because I have been asked to speak to you tonight about the legislation. And after a long summer break, looking again at the legislation was pretty depressing. it is a little bit, being asked to look and read the legislation and describe it is a little bit like being asked to watch an execution and describe it. Someone has to think of the technicalities involved in the procedure. Somebody has to outline that procedure step by step and consider the parts to be played by various actors, and all with the purpose of, and to the end of, directly, intentionally and deliberately killing an innocent person. So somehow making it technical and complicated puts a distance, I think, in people's minds between the act that's being done and their complicity in it. And it enables, I suppose, people who either campaigned for this or voted for it to feel a little easier in their consciences, I think, about doing wrong. I am conscious that we are gathered here tonight in a Catholic church, and I feel I should say something about the abortion referendum and the Catholic Church. What was striking, of course, as David said about the referendum, was the number of Catholics who took part in campaigning for and who voted for this most unjust law. And what came to my mind when I was reflecting on it was a passage that has always stuck with me from Book 1 of St. Thomas More's Utopia. And if I may, I want to read it out to you because I think, as I say, it's always stayed with me, as much for the cleverness of his turn of phrase and his translators as well, as for the profundity of what he says. He says this: "People who have made up their minds to rush headlong down the opposite road are never pleased with the man who calls them back and tells them they're on the wrong course. But apart from that, what did I say that could not and should not be said anywhere and everywhere? If we dismiss as out of the question and absurd everything which the perverse customs of men have made to seem unusual, we shall have to set aside most of the commandments of Christ, even in a community of Christians. Yet he forbade us to dissemble them, and even ordered that what he had whispered to his disciples should be preached openly from the housetops. Most of his teachings differ more radically from the common customs of mankind than my discourse did. But preachers, like the crafty fellows they are, have found that men would rather not change their lives to conform to Christ's rule. And so, just as you suggest, they have accommodated his teaching to the way men live, as if it were a leaden yardstick. At least in that way, they can get the two things to correspond on one level or another. The only real thing they accomplish, that I can see, is to make men feel a little more secure in their consciences about doing evil. And I want to leave that there with you. I don't propose to go through the legislation step by step, but what I wish to do is just highlight the main thrust of the legislation to remind you what it is that our politicians celebrated that day in Dublin Castle in the name, apparently, of women's rights and emancipation from patriarchal oppression. I also want to highlight a couple of the changes that have taken place since May to the legislation, and look at what is further suggested by those in favour of repeal. There was a position paper that has been published by 4 academics. Clearly, to their mind, what is proposed doesn't go far enough. And of course, now that we have got rid of the 8th Amendment from the Constitution, there would be nothing stopping the Oireachtas acceding to their requests and suggestions in the future. Lastly, what I want to look at, which I think is probably the greatest fallout from this whole referendum, is the way in which the government proposes to ride roughshod over the matter of freedom of conscience. And I think that is very, very important, not just in relation to this law, but in relation to all our future laws. So to turn to the legislation, there are 4 grounds, if you remember, under which it will be legally permissible to obtain an abortion. The first, head 4, concerns a risk to the life or of serious harm to the health of the pregnant woman. 2 doctors may certify and have carried out an abortion before viability. Now, the definition of viability has been changed since May. So now it says it's the point in pregnancy at which, in the reasonable opinion of a medical practitioner, the fetus is capable of survival outside the uterus without extraordinary life-sustaining measures. Now this just raises more questions than it answers. What qualifies as a risk of serious harm? There is a risk of serious harm when we walk out the door and cross the road here tonight. It's a small risk, probably though. So what measure of risk should be allowed or warrants the death of an innocent child? What is viability when left to the reasonable opinion of a medical practitioner who gets to decide whether he thinks a baby is capable of surviving outside the womb without extraordinary life-sustaining measures? What are extraordinary life-sustaining measures? There are many babies when they're born that need help to breathe, to stay warm, to feed. Will these be regarded as extraordinary life-sustaining measures? The next head is head 5, and it refers to a risk up to life or health in an emergency. And what this means is that where there is a risk to the life or of serious harm to the health of a woman, including mental health, an abortion may be certified and carried out by one doctor immediately. No gestational limits apply. And I hate to say we told you so, but we told you so. We were accused by those repealers in the debates that took place during the campaign of lying about this. And yet, here it is in black and white. There are no gestational limits, and indeed the Irish Times has actually acknowledged this in an article in July of this year. Head 6 deals with the so-called fatal fetal abnormality provision. And I say so-called because it does not concern, despite all the talk about the certainty of these poor babies dying in utero, that is not what is envisaged by this particular provision. There is no certainty needed to warrant an abortion under this head. The legal requirement is that the death of the baby is likely, and as I said before, in legal terms, likelihood means on the balance of probabilities, which is a greater than 50% chance. The wording has also been changed from a condition that affects the fetus that is likely to lead to the death, either before birth or shortly after birth, to either before or within 28 days of birth. So we can see, as I said, that the stories of the certainty of babies dying in the womb are not what's envisaged here. And as we also pointed out before the referendum, there are many circumstances in which babies have a disability of some sort, who without medical attention, there would be a significant chance, and possibly greater than 50% chance of them dying. But with what are now recognised as fairly routine medical procedures and help, their lives can be sustained. But what is really amazing about all of this is the dishonesty with which its proponents seek to disguise the eugenic aspect of this proposal. I recently turned on the radio in a fit of madness, it has to be said, and this lady who was speaking was talking about the abortion scheme and how it should be broadened to allow for the abortion of children whose conditions weren't actually fatal. But that still definitely was not the abortion of disabled children, she said. So here we have a situation where we're talking about non-fatal disability, But even still, and they're advocating this, but even still, they will not admit that this is what they seek. What level of self-delusion does one have to suffer from to argue that the abortion of babies with non-fatal disabilities is not about disabled children? The position paper that I mentioned earlier on, that is authored by Mairead Enright and Fiona de Londres and a couple of others, calls the 28-day limit in this regard problematic. They actually say the following: the legislation clearly excludes cases where the fetus's life expectancy after birth is short, a matter of months or years, but not as short as 28 days. So in other words, already they are envisaging that a child who may only survive for a few years, or maybe not just have full life expectancy, should come under this head. It should be permissible to abort a child under this head. They go on to say that the clinical guidelines should clarify that in the case of severe fetal diagnosis, whatever that means, that where it's not likely that the baby will die, but there's an independent risk of serious harm to the pregnant person's health, they now think that it is offensive to describe, first we were told it was offensive to describe the pregnant woman as a mother, but now apparently it's offensive to describe her as a woman because that is not sensitive to trans community. So we have to call them pregnant persons now. And that one should basically be allowed to abort one's baby because of fear or because of stress at the idea of having a disabled child. So that child's rights should be set at naught. Finally, Head 7 concerns the 12-week proposal that we heard about, and that is abortion on demand up to 12 weeks. One change that has happened here is that the waiting period of 72 hours has been changed to 3 days because it's thought that the period of 72 hours might be too onerous. Presumably, this would be to allow an abortion on the 3rd day. We could really have a field day with the religious significance of that one. I finally want to just mention about conscience. I'm doing for time there. I think, as I said, it may be one of the most significant in terms of our future laws. Just to remind you, here's what they're proposing: that a doctor, nurse, or midwife will be able to opt out of directly participating in an abortion, although they may not opt out of duty to participate under Head 5, that's the emergency provision. But that freedom of conscience does not extend to other hospital workers, for instance, porters or secretaries or others who might be involved in the provision of an abortion. And anyone who objects to taking part in an abortion must make arrangements to transfer the woman to someone else who will carry out an abortion. This clearly is an affront to the notion of freedom of conscience and is utterly oppressive. Why do I say that the attack on freedom of conscience is almost as significant as the principal evil end to which this legislation is directed? It's because real oppression subsists not just in performing and doing unjust acts, but in requiring others to participate in doing unjust things. It reaches its zenith in requiring the rest of us to do these unjust things against our wills. This is